You know, we've got an interesting subject matter tonight. It's rather not difficult. However, it is also interesting where we find it. Because at this particular reading, or this particular point in reading in Acts, we find that Stephen is giving an instruction on Moses and how Moses lived. And of course, these people he's talking to were Jews, and they would have known the life of Moses, and yet he tells them exactly what happened, and he tells them in certain words to be able to prick their heart and help them understand that the Jesus that they are trying to destroy is the very one that is following in the footsteps of Moses and became the deliverer of us from Satan. Now let's turn over to Acts 7, in fact, and we'll see in verses 20 through 29. Let's take a look at what Stephen says. He says this: at that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for in his father's house. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up, and as her own son, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and in action. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated as an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting, and he tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. Now this is kind of interesting, because we see his first part of his life, that until the time when he was born to the time he was 40 years old, we see that he was no ordinary child. And this was no ordinary time. You see that it says that the child was put away from them, and then that the daughter of Pharaoh found him. Well, what was really going on was that the Pharaoh, I'll get the word right here in a minute. Pharaoh had been upset about the Egyptians as they were growing in number, and they were afraid that they were going to grow in such size that they would take over Egypt. And so what he made a command that all the male children should be thrown into the Nile. Now the Nile was full of crocodiles. And so that'd be the same thing as we said you were thrown into the Everglades or something like that. You know good and well you're going to become alligator food. And crocodiles would have eaten the kids, and that would have been normal. And so he was trying to make sure that the Israelites did not outnumber the Egyptians. Well, that's the ordinary. It's no ordinary time, but he was no ordinary child in the fact that his mother cared for him, wove a basket for him, and put him in it, and that the daughter of Pharaoh found him and made sure that he was safe, because all Hebrew children that were born, boys that were born, were to be thrown into the Nile River. In other words, he was trying his best to annihilate the population. and the women they could overcome, the men would maybe rise up. And he was cared for by the Pharaoh's daughter. Now this is interesting because we read there how he grew up knowing all of Egyptian things and learning all the Egyptian ways. And he was even, it was kind of surprising when you read it, that he was, as he grew up, he was educated and in all wisdom and powerful in speech and action. When later on we find out he's nervous to go back and talk to Pharaoh because he can't speak. And God gives him Aaron, that's with two A's, Aaron, to speak for him. And this is, like I say, an interesting time, an interesting child, and one who was raised up differently than any of the Hebrew. However, he still had the understanding of who he was, and that he was a Hebrew, and so he saw some of his people being mistreated, and he killed an Egyptian. Now, if he was an Egyptian, this wouldn't be a problem, especially if he was Pharaoh's son, this wouldn't be a problem. But because he wasn't Pharaoh's son, it was common knowledge that he killed this Egyptian, obviously, because two of the Hebrews told him they had seen him do that he fled. He ran from Egypt, went all the way up to Midian, and there he found a wife, and he had two sons. And it goes on to say that not only did he flee away, but he thought that, and it was isn't it kind of interesting, because here he is 40, we don't hear from him again till he's 80, and so God must have thought he needed a little tenderizing. In other words, a little help in his attitude adjustment, because what did he think? He thought he could rescue Israel. Now that would make sense because he was raised in Pharaoh's house and all that. Surely he would be able to understand that they need to have some kind of a leadership there, and so he understood Pharaoh and his ways, and so he made sure that was going to happen. It didn't work for him. He had to run away or he would have been killed. Good picture there, isn't it? Of him looking like an Egyptian and having the heart of a Hebrew. Isn't that interesting? So when we see this picture of this is what happens until he's 40. You remember the age in which Jesus started his ministry? It was at the age of 30. Because a man was not even considered a man where you would listen to him until he was 30 years old. Because anybody younger than that would just say stupid things and act stupid ways, and they weren't considered adult enough to be able to give you any important response. Well, he goes off and he goes up into Midian, and he lives there for a while. Let's take a look at Acts chapter 7, verses 30 through 37. Notice what it says. After 40 years had passed, so now he's 80, an angel appeared to the Lord in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went to look more closely, he heard the Lord's voice. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, take off your sandals. The place where you are standing is holy ground. If I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt. 35. This is the same Moses whom they had rejected with the words, who made you ruler and judge? He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out of Egypt and did wonders and miraculous signs in Egypt and at the Red Sea, and for 40 years in the desert. So now all of a sudden, here at age 80, Moses is ready to do what God wants him to do. And God calls him and said, I have heard the pain that is there in the Israelites, and they have suffered long enough, and what we need to do is deliver them. And he called Moses to deliver them. He sees a bush that is burning but not consumed. It is an unusual sight, and he wants to go see it, and so he travels afar until he does see it, and then of course he hears God's voice from the tree, and he takes off his sandals because he is on holy ground as God commands. And we see that Moses did many signs that led Israel out of Egypt. Remember, he did many things. He turned his rod that he used to walk with his staff, he turned it into a snake, and even though the magicians did the same thing, his snake ate their snakes, and as soon as he touched the snake, that turned back into a rod again, and they saw the power of it. And yet Pharaoh had a hard heart, and every time he heard the command from God to let his people go, he did not want that to happen. And so the very first plague was to turn the Nile into blood. And it wasn't turned red or turned into some milky red color. It was turned into blood. It stunk. And it was unusable. They couldn't drink from it. They couldn't use it. And so this thing that they worship, all of the plagues, there were 10 plagues, all of the plagues were gods that the Egyptians worshiped. Even Pharaoh was a god that they worshiped. And so he did these many signs there while he was there, until finally we get to the 10th one, where he tells them to paint the blood on the doorpost and the mantle, and anyone who was within the house that had this blood upon it would be saved from the death angel that goes over it. And when we talk about this, when we teach this, it's important to understand this was the last plague, because God knew that Pharaoh's heart would change after this, and when it did, they were able to leave. In fact, they were so able to leave that when they left, people shoved gold and silver items at them, begging them to leave because their God was destroying their life there in Egypt. And the people there saw these signs, they saw these wonders, all the plagues, and how they did and how they lived. Kind of interesting, years ago, I was teaching 3 to 5 year olds, which was about more my speed. And when I was Moses, when I killed the Egyptian, we had some tarpaulin that was we had painted to look like sand, and so I pulled up the tarpaulin and rolled him underneath it and pulled it back down. And of course, there's a big hump in the floor, but the 3 to 5 year olds didn't notice that. And we did all of the plagues, and then they actually got to eat the plagues. The cows were a vein of sausage with pretzel legs, and probably the most creative one was the locusts, and they had taken and made Rice Krispie, the treats, whatever you call it, and they had dyed it green, so when you when you crunch it, it's crunchy. I thought that was pretty interesting. And then later, when he brings some manna to the people, we would put them to sleep. We'd go around sprinkling sugar frosted flakes on the floor, and they get up and eat them all. That was pretty cool. I enjoyed that part. But he was there purposefully to show them that God was God, and the gods that the Egyptians worshiped were not. And then, of course, he comes to the Red Sea. He parts it, and remember, he parts it where that God did, where not only the waters were on each side, but also that the ground they walked on was totally dry. And there's a lot of pictures about Moses separating the waters, but you know, there are very few of them which actually have dry ground to walk on. Most of them have some water there. That's not what God said. God said it was dry ground. And I was listening to a fellow one time who was talking about, well, he says, I don't know about that. He says, they could have walked across because the Red Sea at certain places is only 3 feet deep. And he said, wow, that's true. What amazes me is that God could kill a whole army in a 3 foot of a Red Sea. You know, and I think that was pretty good comeback that he had for him. But these signs and wonders that he did were there purposefully for them to be able to know God. Remember, they had lived in Egypt for 400 years, so they had already adapted and adopted some of the same concepts and ideas about the gods that Egypt worshipped. And so he wanted to make sure that they understood who he was and how they were supposed to act before him and how they were supposed to listen to him and no one else. And of course, we know that Moses also went to the top of Mount Sinai and got the 10 Commandments. That's what he gave them, was the 10 Commandments. And I submit to you that the 10 Commandments was on 2 different stones, not 5 on one, 5 on another. But remember, the stone, one of the tablets was put into the ark, and the other was put into the town square, or where they camped around in the very trafficked area, so that they would learn the commandments of God. And he also gave them the tabernacle. And this was important because showing that God was right there with them. That did not make them feel powerful or feel good about it. It just made it where that Moses had given it to them. Because when they went to the promised land, and 12 of the men were sent in to be spies into the land, they came back afraid, and they said, we can't take that land. We're like grasshoppers to the people there. They're like giants to us, and we can't do that, even though they brought back great food. In fact, God said that that land was flowing with milk and honey, meaning it was already ready. All they had to do was go in there and take it. That the crops were in the fields, that they already had honey, they'd already taken from the bees, and the cows that these people had would be able to give them milk. And it took, unfortunately, another 40 years for them to wander around in the wilderness until they were ready to go into the promised land, because God did not allow anyone who was against him to live. And it took about 40 years. They probably had thousands of people die a day in which they had to bury him. So this was probably a normal routine. And the key there is that when God says to do something, make sure you do. Notice that this was what is involved in all of the 80 years of his life. 40 years before and the 40 years of wandering after he delivered them. He delivered them, but he delivered a people who would not listen to their God. And so what did he do? He raised up a people who were the children of these people and their children and so on during that 40 years, who had seen God working miracles in the wilderness where it was dry. There was nothing to eat, but he provided for them. There was no water, but he provided that. And so that takes us until he is 120 years old. Now let's go over to Deuteronomy chapter 34, which is going to tell us about how he died. And Deuteronomy, you remember, means the second reading of the law. If you want to take a look at the book of Deuteronomy, it has basically 33 chapters of what Moses said on one mountain, and the people heard him on the other mountain, and all of them stood the whole time. So you ever want to try that, stand up and read the book of Deuteronomy out loud, and you'll see exactly what it was like. But here in chapter 34, we see what happened to Moses. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. Remember, Jericho was the first city that they conquered when they went into Canaan. There, the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev, and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zor. And the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross over into it." And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab. As the Lord had said, he buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where the grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, his strength was not gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, and I looked up and lost my. And in the plains 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. All right, let's talk about this. Here he is now, finally capable. This is after the 40 years of wandering. All the people who were originally there, they came with him, except the children, were dead. They're all gone. They've had problems along the way. Remember, God sent the serpents to them to bite them and kill them, and he had to make a brass serpent and write on a pole and put it up, and we see that today in our medical field. You'll see that brass serpent, meaning when they looked upon the serpent, it saved them even if they had been bitten by the vipers. And so Moses had led them for 40 years in the wilderness. They just wandered around out there, and they would camp places and stay there quite some time, and then they'd wander some more. This plain that we're talking about, this wilderness, is not very big, and it would be easy to be able to get from one side to another within a week and a half on foot. And so here they were just wandering around for 40 years. You can imagine what that looked like to the world. But what was he saying to the Israelites? And by the way, since he said, I have made this promise with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Remember, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And when the tribes grew up over in Goshen and became a nation, when they were let out, they became a nation, and they were called Israelites, or people of Israel. And so they were, in effect, really were not tribal anymore, but a whole community, which is why he gave them a written word. It changed from being a patriarchal society to being a society which had laws written down. And they wandered there for 40 years. They would have to set up the tabernacle, set up all their tents, start the process of sacrifices for sins and so on. They had a lot of animals. God said that He never, their soles of their feet never wore out and their clothes never went threadbare. So He was taking care of them. And when we see that with Moses, the Lord did not allow Moses to enter the promised land, even though he was still viably able to do that. He could still see, he still had strength, he still was capable of leading people, but he couldn't go in because of something he did. And so, for us, this is important as it shows us exactly that God keeps His word, and He will make sure that you keep yours. And so if we work with Him, He will work with us. Now the key here is that Moses has spent a lot of time there and done a lot of things. He sat there probably up on a high place, and God showed him all the way to the ocean, showed him all the way to the Sea of Galilee, all over, that he could see this land, this promised land, and how wonderful it was and how productive it was. You remember that we live in Oregon, and so because of that, you probably know a lot about the Oregon Trail. They say there is a body buried for every mile on the Oregon Trail. And they would bury the people who died in the middle of the trail so that the animals would walk over them and the Indians would not know where to dig up and deface their loved ones. But what were they going to? They called it the Promised Land. And when they got here and they looked out and saw how rich and fertile the valleys were, they knew it was the Promised Land. And we can go today. You can go up here and sit on the hill out on 35. You can go up and sit on the hill out there and look over the valley and see all the produce, the pears and cherries and everything that's growing out there, the vineyards growing. Anywhere you go, you can see the productivity of it. This was the view that Moses had of this promised land. And so they were excited about this land. And he lived faithfully to God until he died. He was old at 120 years old, and when he died, his eyesight was clear, and he was as strong as ever. However, when he died, he had spent his life serving God. He was faithful unto death. Never consider that it's too late for you to do something. Never consider that you are too old to do something. Never consider that you are too weak. God gives the strength, the eyesight, the ability to plan and program and to produce to you, because that's who He is. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. He is the God who brought forth the promise, bringing the Savior. And He is the God who has today given us salvation. Never forget that. Don't sit there and say, well, I'm so old now. I really not much I can do. No. Continue to be faithful unto death. What does that look like? How does that work? Well, continue studying, continue learning, continue telling other people, continue having conversations with people. I mean, especially those you're close with, your grandkids, your children, people that you know well. You can have conversations with them. This morning after we talked about oil and gasoline and stuff like that, and I had several people come to me and say, I never thought about that. We're driving on people and animals. And I said, yes, we are. We're driving on what was left over after the flood. And all those people who died, and all the animals who died, and all the trees that were swept away was pulled back into the earth and allowed to be made into coal and oil. And let me tell you something, they want to look for the ark. That's ridiculous. There wasn't a mature tree left on the earth. And so you think they can build a house? Where are they going to get the wood to build a house? They're going to go out there and cannibalize the ark because they don't need it anymore. Because God said, I'm not going to do that anymore. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to put a rainbow in the cloud, in the sky, for you to be able to know that. And so they could faithfully and easily take away from this ark to be able to build whatever kind of cities they want to build. What do we see in Moses' life? He was faithful. He wanted to be a leader. He wanted to be a deliverer of his people. And it wasn't until 80 years old that God was ready to use him. And he knew that Moses was ready to be used. Oh, there's a lot of arguing and bickering going on, but God knew who he was. And even though Moses complained about this, that, and the other, Moses went, because that was what he did. That was who he was. And he did it until he was 120 years old. That's your job too. Live faithfully unto God until you die. Take advice from him, understand who he was, understand and follow, be directed as he was by God, be able to take the Word of God personally and into your heart and let it direct you to do what is right to do. And there will be times you'll be standing there and all of a sudden you're going to be pushed to be able to say this or that. And the reason you'll be pushed is because it's time and you need to be used by God. I remember, as a last story, I remember a guy who was a missionary. Well, he wasn't a missionary, but he'd gone down and they had sold a building in Mexico, and he was going to take it to the Church of Christ in another part of Mexico. And it was a lot of money. At that time, it was it seemed like $12,000 or $18,000. And nobody had heard from him for a long time, probably a week or two. And everybody was worried that he had been attacked and they'd stolen the money and that maybe he was in bad shape. And so one Wednesday night we got together, and every man in the church, is a pretty good sized church, and every man in the church got up and prayed for this fella and for his well-being, and that we would be able to hear from him. And as soon as I got home, I got a phone call, and they said, so-and-so called, and he said he didn't know why he felt so compelled to call, but he did, and he found out that we were all praying for him. Let me tell you something. There are people out there in the world who are praying for someone you may meet. And you may have the Holy Spirit press upon you that you need to make sure and talk to these people. And it may stop you in your tracks. And you turn around and look at them and be confused about it. But the Holy Spirit will give you the words to say and be able to help you pinpoint their need with what you say. Be faithful unto death. Are you ready to die today? Are you ready for Christ to come today? If you're not right with God, now's the time. Come forward and be baptized, or you can come forward and be rededicated. You can come forward and ask for prayers in the church. Whatever your needs are, now is the time as we stand and we sing this song together.